If you're visiting with us this morning, welcome. Certainly good to have you here. This is our Bible class period. Around 10:13 or 10:12, you'll hear a bell go off, and that if you have children in the back, you can go and get your kids, and then the class will end at 10:15, and then we'll start our worship service. So this week, we're going to be talking about Jesus declaring that I am the light of the world. So we'll be looking at John chapter 8 and John chapter 9 for the most part. This study is a continuation. We are going through the major themes of light and water in chronological order. And so last week we talked about Jesus talking with the woman at the well and telling her that he is the living water. And today, right after that, in the book of John, is Jesus declaring, I am the light of the world. Just also, as a progression of kind of where we'll be going, the three different topics is John 8, verse 12, Jesus is claiming to be the light. In John 9, he's proving that he is the light. And then in John 12, he's warning us to respond about the light. So we'll go ahead and start in John chapter 8 and verses 12. So for John 8 verses 12, if you have a physical Bible, I want you to kind of flip back actually to John chapter 7. So John 7 verse 2 is starting to set up the scene of, I think really I'm going to talk a little bit about the history and the background of how we get to John 8. But John 7 verse 2, we see that the Feast of Booths is at hand and drawing near. Now if you look at John 7 verse 37, or 7 verse 14. So Jesus is talking with his brothers. The Feast of Booths is drawing near, and they tell him, why don't you go and speak? And he says, no, it's not my time. But he does end up going into the temple and during the midst of the feast and preaching in the temple. And we see that in 7 verses 14. As Jesus is continuing to go back to the temple regularly, in John 7, verse 37, you see that it's the last day of the great feast, and Jesus stood out crying and saying, if anyone is thirsty, let them come to me and drink. The reason I'm going to talk about the Feast of Booths, and that's kind of why I wanted to set it up, is the Feast of Booths is established in the Old Testament, and it was really a memorial for the Israelites to remember coming out of Egypt. And so God had set some instructions for them of these are, this is what I want you to do for the feast. If you go and look at secular writings, what the Jews did was really expand on what the requirements were. And so as you go and study Jesus declaring, I am the light of the world, one of the things that they always point to is this Feast of Booths. And during the Feast of Booths, the Jews had kind of added this extra part to the ceremony, and it was lighting these huge lamps. And they would light the lamps in the temple courts as kind of showing or an example of the pillar of fire. God leading the Israelites out with the pillar of fire. And so these Jewish leaders had kind of taken one thing, added to it, made it different, added a part to the Feast of Booths that wasn't originally intended, and then almost, it seems like, makes it one of the main themes that they want to talk about. So as we get into John chapter 8, it is at the end of Feast of Booths where the Jews have added these extra religious lamps, these lanterns that they have lit up, and Jesus is now declaring to them, I am the light of the world. And so that's kind of the introduction as we get to John 8, verse 12. And Jesus again spoke to them, saying, I am the light of the world. He who follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. So the Pharisee said to them, you are testifying about yourself. Your testimony is not true. So Jesus kind of takes this special time and is declaring he is the light of the world right after these long, week-long religious festivities in which they have added to God's word. And it just seems like the Pharisees here, in my mind, are getting really worked up about the tradition of him breaking the tradition and not necessarily listening to what he has to say. Any thoughts? Or yeah, there. Yeah. So when I first was reading this, I was very nervous about bringing this up because it was not part of the original text. Like when I went back and I read like the Feast of Booths and all of the things, and they mention it in Leviticus and Numbers and Exodus in a bunch of different spots, it never does it mention, I want you to light pillars of fire. And so from what I can tell, it is, it does say in Leviticus at the end, the point of the Feast of Booths is to symbolize Israel coming out of Egypt. And so the best that I could think of is, the Pharisees, or, the Jewish leaders, and honestly, we probably do this today. We take something. The point is to symbolize Egypt, leaving Egypt. And in that process, we see being led out by a pillar of fire. And so, hey, to add on to extra symbolism, why don't we do this to help symbolize us being led out? And so multiple different ancient manuscripts had said in there, like outside where the temple was, there was like an open court area, and they had built towers, 4 towers that were 50 feet tall, that had almost what it read like the Olympic Games. Huge bowls of oil, and priests would walk up a ladder and would have a ceremonial wick and light this lighting ceremony every single night for the entire Feast of Booths. And they said that the light is so bright that it would light up every courtyard in Jerusalem. And so they really made it this ceremonial, like this is almost, from what I was reading, it almost read like they were making the lighting ceremony more important than all of the actual instructions that God had given in Leviticus. Yeah. So thank you. So the other part so I was really nervous because of just like, man, it seems to be secular writing that I'm pulling this information and not necessarily. But then when I started thinking about it more, it's like, man, it just seems like something that would be so common for the Pharisees or the Jewish leaders to add on and then make it so important that when Jesus says, I am the light of the world, now we're going to be almost defensive about like, well, wait a minute, what about our traditions? And so that's, the more I pondered on that, I thought, bring it up. Lindsay, did you have something? The light's not coming from the temple, it's coming from Jesus. Yeah, I think so too. Thank you. Any other thoughts or comments or points that we find interesting? Yeah, make it a little bit bigger. Yeah, I think that's a good visual representation of ways of thinking about it. Thank you. So now, Jesus declares, "I am the light of the world" in chapter 8, verse 12. So the rest of chapter 8 is a long dialogue of argument, between Jesus and the Pharisees. So Jesus is continuing, from what I can tell, this is all, inside the temple of discussion. And you get down to the end of chapter 8, and chapter 8, verses 40 or 59. Therefore, they picked up stones to throw at Jesus, but Jesus hid himself and went out of the temple. We're going to now go into John chapter 9, verses 1 through 12. So the other interesting part that I think about this, Jesus declaring, "I am the light of the world," is just how quickly it is, like back to back. So we haven't really read about it, him declaring it to the Jewish leaders. He does it one day during the Feast of Booths. They almost kill him at the temple. So then he's leaving, and as he's leaving the temple, he's going to declare it again. So we'll start up in John chapter 9, verses 1 through 12. And as he passed by, he saw a blind man from birth, and his disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he would be born blind?" And Jesus answered and said, "It was neither that this man sinned nor his parents, but it was that the works of God might be displayed in him. We must work the work of works of him who sent me, as long as it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. While I am in the world, I am the light of the world." When he had said this, he spat on the ground and made clay of the spittle and applied the clay to his eyes. And he said to him, "Go, wash in the pool of Siloam," which is translated to be sent. So he went away and washed, and he came back seeing. Therefore, the neighbors and those who previously saw him as a beggar were saying, "Is not this the one who used to sit and beg?" Others were saying, "This is he." Still others were saying, "No, but he is like him." But the man kept saying, "I am the one." So they were saying to him, "How then were your eyes opened?" He answered and said, "The man who is called Jesus made clay and anointed my eyes and said to me, 'Go to Siloam and wash.' So I went away and I washed, and I received sight." They said to him, "Where is he?" He said, "I do not know." All right. So what is, when I first read it, I think the one thing that sticks out to me is just how quickly, Jesus is leaving the temple after almost being stoned. So Jesus is leaving the temple, and that first question, I want you all to think about that first question. Jesus, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Just think about that question. If it was a Bible game where it was quiz, and I said, "Who said this quote?" and I read that off, would you all guess that question came from a Pharisees trying to trick and trap Jesus? Or would you guess that question came from the disciples? It was just gut level feeling. That's how I felt too. It seems like a very common question that you would read a Pharisee asking Jesus. You're walking out of the temple. There's a blind person. Hey, what about him? Tell me about him. Who sinned? Let me try to trap you. This is how I kind of read it. who sinned? Was it him that sinned or his parents that sinned? And the part that really struck me about the disciples is I don't think that that's their attitude of trapping Jesus. Their attitude was not trapping Jesus. The thing that struck me is for disciples is they're asking a question about almost knowledge and not seeing a person that needs love and being taken care of and compassion. So I think the first thing that sticks out at me is, the disciples look at the man and they say, who caused this? Like, why is this happening? And Jesus looks at that person and he says, what can God do through this person? What can God do because of this situation? We might ask, ourselves, I think just a point of application is just like when situations arise and things come up, instead of us asking for knowledge or trying to accuse or find blame or get to the bottom of the problem, we would be better suited to take Jesus' approach and ask, what can God do through this situation? What can God do? Share. Yeah, so I'm not, I agree. It's a logical question. It just struck me that it's like if I wrote down that question, who said it, the disciples or the Pharisees, I would 9 times out of 10 say that sounds like a Pharisee question and not necessarily a disciple question. And when I thought about that, it's like, man, if the disciples are asking that question, that is definitely a question I can see myself asking. Like, I see a problem and be like, who caused this problem? And yet Jesus is saying, how can God work through this? Like, how can we show God's power through this? That just was like the first point of enlightenment for me. It's just like, man, when I encounter situations, instead of saying, how did this happen? How can God be glorified through this? Is my first. Yep. Thank you. I appreciate it. Okay. Yeah, I think, thank you. Yeah. No, I think you're absolutely right. Just like expanding their knowledge of like you're not even thinking about it the correct way. Thank you. All right, so at the end of verse 12, or I guess verse 11, um, Jesus puts clay on his eyes. He tells him to go wash. Um, I guess verse 7. So we went away and washed, and he came back seeing. But then we go down, and they said, verse 10, how then were your eyes opened? And he answered, and he said, the man who is called Jesus made clay and anointed my eyes. At the end of verse 11, do you all think that this man has seen Jesus? Yeah. I agree. Like, yeah, so when I say see, I mean like physically see. Do you think at this time, at the end of verse 11, he has physically seen who Jesus is? Because I don't. I read it as he went away, you know, the beggar is blind and he can only hear Jesus. And I just think about, you know, how does he know that it was Jesus? He hasn't seen him. He's only picking up, he's a beggar on the side, like at the exit of the temple, and he hears either the disciples or other people around him saying, Rabbi, tell us about this man. And so he can only, at this point, hear the voice of Jesus, but he knows that's the man that healed me. So he's blind, he gets the spittle, the clay on his eyes, he goes and washes, and he comes back. And even before physically seeing Jesus, he already has the answer. The man who is called Jesus made clay and anointed my eyes. Did you have something? Yeah. I just think, yeah, I am heading toward that. So yes, you are right. I just think like if you are a blind person and you can only hear people around you, and you hear people talking about you, and then you would feel someone putting clay on your eyes, and then going and washing off, and now you see. And they came back and said, "Who healed you?" I believe it would be almost pretty common to say, "I don't know. I haven't seen." But that's like it was Jesus. Jesus the man put clay on my eyes and he washed me. And they said, "Where is he?" I don't know. I don't know yet because I haven't seen him. Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, I completely agree. Just when I start thinking about what that scene would look like, and then putting yourself in the place of the blind man, there's a lot to it that I hadn't really considered. But yeah, yeah, yep. So we're going to end up reading pretty much all of John chapter 9 today. Yep. Yep, I completely agree. So, yeah, he knew. I mean, that's my main point is just mostly like at this point, he hadn't physically seen Jesus, but his answer was it was the Jesus, the man, is the person. So, moving on. Yeah, yeah, he didn't see him, but he still knew. So, yeah, he had the faith. Good. Thank you. So, verse 13 through 17. So they brought the blind man to the Pharisees, and so they brought to the Pharisees the man who was formerly blind. Now it was a Sabbath on the day when Jesus made the clay and opened his eyes. Then the Pharisees also were asking him again how he received his sight. And he said to them, "He applied clay to my eyes, and I washed, and I see." Therefore, some of the Pharisees were saying, "This man is not from God, because he does not keep the Sabbath." Others were saying, "How can a man who is a sinner perform such signs?" And there was a division among them. So they said to the blind man again, "What do you say about him, since he opened your eyes?" And he said, "He is a prophet." I think the first part, you catch, what's different now than before? You catch almost like the increase of knowledge. Yesterday, who was it that healed him? The man named Jesus. Today, after a little bit of reflection, who is he? He's a prophet. So there is some growth. There is some growth. Yep. No, thank you. All right. So a point in another point that I'd like to make. So the first point of application is just the progression. So at first Jesus was a man. Now he's a prophet. We're also kind of into a section about the Pharisees asking, their religious pride can make like they were defending the systems, even amongst themselves. Let's just argue amongst ourselves instead of let's spend our time arguing instead of recognizing and appreciating God's power and God's work. So here I had written, for us, it's more important to focus on doing the right thing, focus on doing what's right, instead of just following the rules. So for us, the point of application I made is just focusing on the right thing and not just the rules. Because the Pharisees saw the miracle, and yet they wanted to argue about, well, what rules did they break? What rules is he not following? Instead of recognizing the power of God. Moving on to verse 18. The Jews then did not believe it of him, and he had been, they did not believe that he had been blind and received sight until they called the parents of the very one who had received his sight. And they questioned the parents, saying, "Is this your son, who you say was born blind? Then how does he see?" His parents answered them and said, "We know this is our son, and we know that he was born blind. But how he now sees, we do not know. Or who opened his eyes, we do not know. Ask him. He's of age. He'll speak for himself." His parents said this because they were afraid of the Jews. For the Jews had already agreed that if anyone confessed him to be Christ, he was to be put out of the synagogue. For this reason, his parents said, "He is of age." What strikes you all about that? Yeah, I would 100% agree. They knew that Jesus had healed their son. Yeah. And we're not willing to take it any further than that, Scott. Declaring Jesus was going to be a little bit too inconvenient. Declaring who Jesus was going to disrupt the customs and going to disrupt their life. That will be too inconvenient. We're going to lose our friends. We're going to get kicked out of church. What will people think about us? What will people say about us? They knew that it was Jesus, but it was just going to be too inconvenient. Yeah, I would agree. Yeah, so I think it's almost better to be ignorant and blind, rather than think that you can see, think that you have the knowledge and can see when you. Thank you. We're gonna we're gonna get to the bottom of this. Yeah. Yeah. No, I completely. Yeah, I agree. Yeah. Yeah. Looking for excuses or a way out, or yeah. Yeah, I'm not. Yeah, I completely agree. So when I read this, one of the situations, like I kept trying to put myself in different, like trying to be the people in the story. So during this part, I just, what would it be like to be the parent? If I just visualize putting myself in as the parent's shoes. You've raised this child for 20 years. He's a young adult, and he has never seen your face. He's out at the temple begging, and he comes home, and the neighbors see him, the friends see him, and he walks through, and for the first time in your life, he gets to see mom and dad. And I just think, being a father, like, there are so many times when my children do something, and I'm just overwhelmed with joy of just seeing how excited they are makes me so excited. Or just like if I went away to college and was gone for a semester and I came home, my mom would just light up. Like, I've only been gone a couple of months. So I just imagine his parents and his mother and his father weeping for joy that their son can now see. And the son, be like, you guys would not believe what happened. It was Jesus. Jesus healed me. This is the story. I can now see. He was a man. He's a prophet. It's Jesus. The next day, the Jewish leaders come in, and you are still, in my mind, overwhelmed with joy, knowing that it's Jesus. And just like, ugh. Why don't you ask him the hard questions? Confessing that it is Jesus, the Son of God, is going to be a little too inconvenient for disrupting my synagogue service. So he's of age. Yes, he was blind, but go ahead and ask him. And I think when I was pondering on that, just the blessings, there are times in my life where I want to receive the joy and the benefits of Christ, but there are times to proclaim Christ, and it seems a little too inconvenient. And that struck home with me. Yeah. Yep. 100%. It's going to be tough, but life changing. So I got to move on. I'm sorry. All right. So moving on from 24 to 34, we have about 5 minutes left. I'm going to summarize 24 through 34. But so a second time they call him and they said, who did this? And he says, do you all want to be disciples of Jesus too? And they rebuked him. And then the blind man kind of gives them a history lesson. The blind man says, he is from God. Nobody has been healed from blindness unless they were from God. So verse 33, if this man were not from God, he could do nothing. In verse 34, so they answered him and said, you were born entirely in sins, and you're trying to teach us? So they put him out. Verse 35, Jesus heard that they had put him out, and finding him, he said, do you believe in the Son of Man? And he answered, who is he, Lord, that I may believe in him? And Jesus said to him, you have both seen him, and he is the one talking to you. And he said, Lord, I believe. And he worshipped him. And Jesus said, for judgment I came into this world, so that those who do not see me may see me, and those who see me may become blind. Those of the Pharisees who were with him heard these things and said, we are not blind too, are we? And Jesus said to them, if you were blind, you have no sin, but since you say, we see, your sin remains. So I want us to look at verse 38 again, and verse 36. Jesus said, do you believe in the Son of Man? Who is he, Lord, that I may believe? Verse 38, and he said, Lord, I believe. and he worshiped. I want us to go back and think about that progression. When he was first healed, he's a man. A day later, he's a prophet. A little bit later, he's God. And a little bit later, he is the Lord. And it will cause him to worship. So it's just a phase of progression, a phase of growth. And I just look at that and just think, multiple points of application, just like growing takes time. Understanding, like recognizing the blessings of Jesus helps us appreciate more who he is. And I just think that it's important to kind of see the progression through there. Yep. Yep. It's a wonderful story. I appreciate everybody's participation. Thank you. Next week, we'll be talking about the Transfiguration.